Okay. So in 1978, Khomeini was asked by the Iraqi authorities to leave Iraq, and he went to Paris to stay there for about 1 year. First, he did not want to go to Paris. He applied to several countries, but none accepted them. So he left for Paris. And he also never visited the center of Paris. He lived in one of the neighborhoods of Paris, and he lived there for about 1 year. And in 1979, in February the 1st, Khomeini came back to Iran after 15 years of exile. When Khomeini came back in 1979, the Shah had left before like 20 days. So the Shah left, and then Khomeini came. So they said Shah Raft Imam Ahmed in Persian, which means the Shah left and the Imam, meaning Imam Khomeini, they called him Imam, came back to Iran. So everything took place after the coming of Khomeini to Iran. In March, the late of March, a referendum was held in which the Islamic Republic of Iran was accepted. So Iran's monarchy was abolished, and a republic, an Islamic republic, was created in its place. And then a few months later, in December 1979, the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran was accepted. So this was the second constitution after the constitution of 1906, which means,
Serhan.
let me cut a very long story short for you. Everybody in Iran, I mean, every political group, I would say, were unhappy about the Shah. The leftists, the Tudeh party, and other leftist groups, the nationalists who came from the line of Mohammed Mossadegh, especially the Nehzat Azadi or the liberation movement, the nationalist movement, they were unhappy about him, and also the Islamists, the so-called Islamists, pro-Khomeini people, they were also very unhappy about him. Why? Because they saw him as a servant of the Americans, as a servant of imperialism, and also they were unhappy about his policies because the Shah was a real despot. He was very, very authoritarian. He ruled the country by his will. There was no real politics in Iran during the period of Mohammad Reza Shah. And he created enemies almost from every walk of life, not also from the pro-Khomeini people, but also he got enemies from the leftists. He got enemies from, as I said, the nationalists. So the common cause for all the people, for all the political groups in Iran, was the overthrow of the Shah. They wanted to get rid of the Shah. For this reason, some people today, some Iranian historians, they reject the idea of Islamic revolution. They say this was not an Islamic revolution. They say the revolution was later on Islamicized, but in the beginning, it was an Iranian revolution, which means in this revolution, not only the Islamists, pro-Khomeini people, but also the leftists and also the nationalists took place. So according to them, the revolution was not a product of Khomeini or pro-Khomeini people, but was also a common product of all political struggle made by different groups of people within Iran. And the Shah killed many people, and later on he was tried and found guilty for these crimes, of course, in his absence, because he left for Egypt for the first before the coming of Khomeini, and then he went to the US, and then he went to Panama, and then he came back to Egypt, and in Egypt he died, and he was buried in Egypt. But some people, like for example, Huweida, the Shah's prime minister for 13 years. He was also tried in the court and he was sentenced to death. So a lot of people who worked with Mohammad Reza Shah, they were executed for the crimes committed by the Shah regime. But then, shortly after the revolution, in 1980 September, a war broke out between Iran and Iraq. This war is also a very long story, why this war broke out and why did it last so long, for 8 years. From 1980 until 1988, the war lasted for 8 years until the two sides accepted the ceasefire and the war ended in 1988. And 1 year after the war ended, Khomeini died. So Khomeini was no longer in 1989. Khomeini's regime, or the Islamic Republic of Iran, was based on two different ideas. One idea was republicanism, as we know it in Turkey, as we know it in many countries which are republics. But on the other hand, the country was an Islamic country based on the idea of wilayat faqih, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. And what was that? According to Ayatollah Khomeini, prominent scholars from among the Shiite mullahs, they should recite over the affairs of the country. So they, according to Khomeini, it was a mullah, a prominent ayatollah, was to give direction to the state policies. And Velayat Faqih was put in Iranian constitution. And I can say that the principal power in the Islamic, the constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also in the state institution, is this Velayat Faqih, also known as supreme leadership. Today, this authority is better known as supreme leadership, or rehber-i ingılap, devrim rehberliği. So devrim rehberi, or veli faqih, velayat faqih, is the principal power in Iran, but at the same time, you have a president, which means the supreme leader takes authority from Islam, so he is supported by Islamic teachings, and the president is based on popular vote. He is elected by people every 4 years. So a president is elected every 4 years, and someone can be elected only for 2 terms, which means someone can only serve as president for 8 years, for consecutive 8 years. Okay. When Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989, a new age or a new phase started in the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Ayatollah Ali Khamenei became the new supreme leader, the Veli Faqih, the new Veli Faqih after Khomeini. And Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is still holding that power. So from 1989 until 2021, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has been the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this is very briefly the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But let me share with you some of the significant dimensions of this new state known as the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic of Iran has 2 armies, as I said, has 2 authorities, the supreme leader and the president, and also has 2 armies. One of them is Ertesh, literally army in Persian, which was the army created by Reza Shah and reinforced by Mohammad Reza Shah. So the conventional, the traditional army of Iran. But then after the revolution, a new army was created, especially for a fight against Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. And this army was called the Revolutionary Guards, Devrim Muhafızları ordusu. Okay, the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards, they were the men who fought in the war against Saddam Hussein in the war. But when the war ended, first of all, there was a huge lack of trust against the commanders and the officers of Shah in the traditional army, in Ertesh. So they basically did not trust them. And they needed a lot of new soldiers to fight in the fronts against Iraq. And these soldiers were recruited with a different mentality, like teenagers were taken into the army to fight the battle. And these people were all pro-Khomeini, and they fought and died for the Islamic Republic. And some of the officers, like high-ranking commanders in Ertesh or the Shah's army, they were put into jail because of the crimes committed by the Shah's regime. So they basically did not trust the traditional army, and they thought it was incapable of maintaining the war, such a huge war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Okay, but the real story started when the war ended, because there was a discussion among the revolutionaries who believed in revolution and who followed the path of Ayatollah Khomeini. Some of them said that now we have to abolish this new army and get it integrated into the conventional army, Ertesh. So according to them, Iran must have only one army. And Ayatollah Rafsanjani, for example, one of the prominent figures, he held this idea. He said, okay, this army served its purpose, and now the war is over. We have to dismantle this army and go on with the Ertesh. What happens in a possible conflict? How do the armies positioning? And very good question, Mansur. The Revolutionary Guards or Devrim Muhafızları is the most powerful army in Iran. So the army is the Revolutionary Guards. Compared with the Revolutionary Guards, the Ertesh, the traditional army, is substantially weak. Okay, so theoretically, you cannot have any conflict between these two armies because the Revolutionary Guards is a lot more powerful and a lot better equipped than the conventional Ertesh. Okay, but after 1989, this Revolutionary Guard started gaining not only military power, but also political power. A lot of people from the ranks of this army, they went into politics, they became politicians, they became MPs, they became ministers, and some of them even tried to run for presidency, okay? And also economically speaking, the Devrim Muhafızları or the Revolutionary Guards became very powerful in terms of their economic resources. They became very rich. And some people today, they say that about 50% of Iran's economy, official economy, is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards in one way or the other, directly or indirectly. Okay, so economically speaking, this army came to be very, very powerful. And the regime saw this army as a guarantor of Iran's economy. So they thought if this army takes hold over the country's economy, the foreigners, the enemies cannot penetrate into our economy. Okay, so the state economy is basically controlled, at least 50% of it, by these Revolutionary Guards. Okay, and during the 1990s, a lot of things changed in Iran. Like, for example, when the revolution took place in 1979, Iran's population was about 39 million, and it's now 82 million. So which means a lot of people were born after the revolution. So more than half of the population was born after the revolution. And these people, especially people like you, for example, even like me, younger people, they came with different demands. They wanted democracy, they wanted individual rights, and they wanted integration with the outside world, okay? But the ideology of the regime, of course, made this impossible because shortly after the revolution, the American embassy in Iran was invaded. in November the 4th, and America and the Islamic Republic of Iran became bitter enemies from that time on. They never fought a direct war against one another, but the tension has always been there between America and the Islamic Republic of Iran. So the call for reform and for reopening to the world in 1990s was left unresponded by the regime. But a surprise came in 1997. A man named Mohammad Khatami, a reformist politician, became the president by defeating his conservative rival. And according to many people, this was a very good opportunity for reform, for reintegration to the outside world, and for getting and gaining individual rights. And this indeed has been the case. Mohammed Khatami made a lot of moves towards a more democratic regime, but in 2001, anti-regime group in the US, Mujahideen Khalq, they came up with a news about Iran's nuclear program. So they told the world, they disclosed documents saying that Iran was going after nuclear power. And so in 2001, Iran's nuclear file started to become a very important matter of debate in the international community, especially in the US. The US declared that they would never let Iran to become a nuclear power. And this became a new problem, a new reason of tension between Iran, the US, and also Israel in the Middle East, along with the Arabs, prominently Saudi Arabia. And when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was elected president in 2005, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was a very conservative figure. He was anti-American, and he supported nuclear program, although he said it was for peaceful purposes, not for military purposes. But then the United States started imposing new sanctions, new embargoes against Iran, and this gave birth to what we know the Iran nuclear deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which was signed in July 2015 and came into effect in January 2016 when Ahmed Rouhani was president. So Hassan Rouhani was elected president after Ahmadinejad in 2013. He started negotiations for this deal, and the deal was finally signed and came into effect in January 2016. And what happened? According to this treaty, Iran's nuclear program was restricted substantially, and it was guaranteed by Iran that Iran would never develop nuclear capacity. So Iran was never to become a nuclear power. And in return, the Americans lifted some of the sanctions. So they lifted the embargoes on the Iranian economy. So Iran started experiencing an economic growth after being able to communicate and make business with the outside world. And this has been the case until Donald Trump became president in 2016. Donald Trump regarded this deal as the worst deal of history. And he said, if I am elected president, which he was elected later on, as you know, he said, I will get rid of this deal. And he did what he said in 1918. He said, I am also out of this deal. He left the deal. And he started imposing new sanctions, which he called maximum pressure policy against Iran. So he started to pressurize Iran at the maximum level, especially economically. and he started to enable, disabled, Iran from selling its oil, which is the principal source of income for Iran. And he started to pressurize Iran's economy, and he was very successful. Now, the statistics tell us that Iran is in a very difficult position as far as its political indicators are concerned. Can ordinary people participate in the elections? Is the election competition equal to candidates? Very good question. No. On paper, yes. On paper, everybody can run for presidency, but everybody meaning that those who accept the religion of the state, which is the 12er Shiism. So if you are not a Shiite, you have no chance of running for presidency in Iran. But even if you are a Shiite, a devout Shiite Muslim, you have almost zero chance to become a president, because there is also an expediency council which controls the candidates and allows or disallows people from running for presidency. So in practice, only a limited number of people can run for presidency. Let me give you an example. In every election in Iran, just like in the last election in 2017, for example, and the new election is coming, by the way. Iran has another election for presidential election in 2021 May. So in the last election in 2017, about 1,000 people applied for candidacy to become candidate for presidency, but they were not allowed by the regime. Okay, so we cannot talk about equal chances for running presidency in Iran. So the democratic practices of Iran are very limited. I wouldn't say it's zero, but it's very close to zero, I would say. Okay. So Iranian economy is in a very difficult position, is in a hard position. Iranian people are suffering very hard economically very hard periods. And according to me, Iran terribly needs another deal with the Americans. And this is their hope from the new president of the United States, Joe Biden. So they think, or they hope, that Biden will go back to the deal and will lift some of the sanctions imposed by Trump on Iran. Of course, this also will need a lot of negotiations between these two states, because the previous negotiation, the negotiation of 2015, took about at least 6 years to be completed. So they negotiated for first secret negotiations started in Oman, and then open negotiations started in Brussels. And then after 5 years, the negotiations produced this Iran nuclear deal. So Iran hopes that Biden will come up with a new deal, or he will go back to the nuclear deal, but this will also need a lot of negotiations between the states. Ismail, do you have a question? No, you don't have a question. Okay. Now let's go into some of the international problems or international issues around Iran. First of all, just in the last week, I was working on a paper on Iran's policy during the Arab Spring. We all know what has been going on in some of the Arab countries, starting from Tunis, and then Algeria, and then Egypt, and of course, Libya, and definitely Syria, right? Turkey, for example, has a position. Turkey supported the will of the people. In Egypt, Turkey objected the Sisi coup d'etat in Egypt. And also Turkey thought in the beginning of the Arab Spring that Assad, for example, in Syria must be gone, because Turkey thought, and this is still the opinion of Turkey, by the way, but we don't know what will happen definitely, that with Assad remaining in power, Syria cannot be a democratic country. Okay, so we cannot talk about democratic transition under the control of Bashar al-Assad. But Iran's position was different from the very beginning. Iran, in the beginning of the Arab Spring, when it broke out for the first time in 2011, Iran said that these revolutions were like the Islamic revolution of Iran, Bidari Islami. So this was an Islamic awakening, according to Iran, okay? Ayatollah Khamenei said, we celebrate people, we support people who went out to the streets for Islamic awakening, Bidari Islami, okay? And this has been the case until it came to Syria. When the popular movements started in Syria, Iran said this is not a popular movement. He said this is a project of the imperialists. He said, Iran said, the imperialists want to get rid of Bashar Assad because Bashar Assad, along with Hezbollah in Lebanon, they are pro-Khomeini and they are fighting against imperialism. So, and Iran made everything possible to make sure that Bashar Assad remains in power. Okay, and this has been Iran's main policy, and this policy will never change. I mean, at some point, for example, you can say that Russia can abandon Bashar Assad. Okay, Russia can say that, okay, Assad can go if a better option can come to power. But Iran will never change its position about Bashar Assad. Because according to Iran, as I said, Bashar Assad, along with Hezbollah in Lebanon, are within the axis of defense against the Zionists, which means Israel, according to Iran, and the imperialists, which means, of course, the United States of America. So this is basically Iran's Arab Spring policy. If you have any questions, since we got only 10 minutes left, Ahmet Hocam, if you like, we can go for Q&A. Yes.
I would like to ask one question. You mentioned, can I ask a question?
Yes, ladies first, of course.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'd like to express my gratitude for your incredible explanation, first of all. And in the explanation, you mentioned about the joint comprehensive plan of action. And you also talk about how U.S. withdrawal impacted Iran significantly in terms of economy. So my question is, and I also wonder about this issue, that what are the consequences of U.S. withdrawal in terms of international security and also regional development in Middle East? Thank you.
Okay, very good question. First of all, let me say this forthwith, that I think Trump's withdrawal from the deal was illegal. Illegal meaning that although I am very suspicious of Iran's Middle East policies, when Trump left the deal, every international organization, especially International Atomic Agency, was of the idea that Iran was following the deal. So Iran did nothing against the deal. Okay, so it was, I think, illegal as far as the framework of the deal was concerned. But how it impacted the regional security? Look what Donald Trump did in the Middle East. For example, he supported almost without any limits the Netanyahu government in Israel and its occupation of the West Bank, okay? Although this is still an ongoing process on the one hand. And on the other hand, by using the Iran fear, Iran mania, the Iran fear, he pushed the Arabs, especially the United States of Arab Emirates, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, and they say some other countries will also follow. So by using the Iran fear, they pushed these countries to normalize their relations with Israel at a time when Israel is increasingly becoming an abnormal state, especially the Netanyahu government. Okay, so they are creating a dichotomy, okay, in the Basra Gulf or the Persian Gulf, as they call it. On the one side, you have Israel, and on the other side, you have Iran. So by using this Iran fear, a lot of Arab states are coming closer to Israel, and this, I think, will not serve to the interests of the region in terms of security. I think this is one of the main consequences of Trump's behavior, and also, of course, Iran is being feeling under threat from Israel and also from the US, and it's supporting and enhancing its proxies in the Middle East. Okay, and these proxies, ladies and gentlemen, are very dangerous phenomena. Okay, I mean, we have not seen their consequences yet, but unfortunately we will see them if this tension goes on. So Iran has a lot of very powerful, significant proxies in Iraq. Hashd Shaabi, you know that. Hezbollah is universally known. Also in Syria, like Fatimiyun and Zaynabiyun corpses. Okay, so Iran is trying to guarantee its security by putting the region into danger. And this is also one of the consequences of Trump's behavior. I mean, Trump didn't start this. Iran has been doing that since the revolution and even before the revolution. But Trump increased or accelerated this process.
Can I also ask a question, please?
Yes, John, sure.
First of all, I like to thank you for this informative course, Professor. We already mentioned Iran's current situation. They currently have a bad economy, as you said, and we will see soon what's going to happen about the nuclear agreement they did with the United States of America under the Biden administration. Do you think that this economic situation will make Iran less important than before in the Middle East? Because why I ask this question is, I mean, how long can a country live without a good economy and the outside of its own territory? Thank you very much.
You are welcome. This is an excellent question, and we can discuss the answer of this question for hours, really. I'm not exaggerating.
I guess so, yeah, you're right.
Yes, really, I mean, this is a very long discussion, but let me cut it short. First of all, there is something about Iran which is not in Turkey. The Iranian regime or the Iranian state does not need its population, its people, for its economic survival. Okay? I mean, a normal state like Turkey, for example, you need your population. Your population must be happy, must be satisfied. So they must have the incentives for economic production because you don't have natural resources. You cannot rely on oil, natural gas, etc., which is something good, by the way. I'm not saying that is something bad. This is how a normal country behaves. But in Iran, the state revenues, the revenues needed for official state policies do not come from civil economy, so to speak, okay? They mainly come from oil revenues and natural gas revenues. And as long as Iran makes sure that these revenues are in place, they will not have any problems in continuing and protecting the policies in the region, in pursuing, for example, ballistic missile program or nuclear program, okay? But there is a limit to that because Iran, under normal conditions, sells a lot of oil. In normal conditions, it was around 2 million barrels a day, and now it's close to zero. Not zero, but it's close to zero. And if this continues, if Iran is unable to sell its oil for the months to come, then Iran will have a lot of problems. And this is what the Iranian authorities are trying to do to come up with a better deal and to be able to sell their oil. Ahmet Yesevi and Said Javad Tabatabai are definitely and entirely two different figures. Ahmet Yesevi was a very interesting figure, but he lived a lot long ago. Said Javad Tabatabai is still writing. The common point between them is Iranian nationalism, not Persian nationalism. Please do not confuse these terms. Iranian nationalism is something, Persian nationalism is something else. And what we know is Iranian nationalism, okay? The idea of Iran Shahri, the idea of Iranian civilization and Serzemini Iran, the Iranian land, okay? But Iranian nationalism is a very long story. The question of PKK, Iran never accepts that they supported or tolerated PKK at some point of its history, like during the last almost 40 years. But there are a lot of indications and proofs showing us that Iran tolerated and even used PKK against Turkey in some way or the other. Doesn't mean that they attacked Turkey against Turkey by using the PKK, no. But look at, for example, PYD, YPG in Syria. Does anybody know what Iran thinks about these people? Not really. Is Iran uncomfortable about these people? Not really. Okay, so Iran thinks this is Turkey's problem, and Turkey, as long as Turkey is busy with these problems, Turkey will not have enough time to go into other issues in the Middle East. So this is all I can say about Iran-PKK relations for the moment. And economic pressure is, as I said, a very long story, but the Iranian state is very smart, and they have been storing the money. They have been storing the money they earned from oil incomes for decades. So they still have a lot of money. I can say, for example, they can take this pressure for about 1 or 2 years, for the next 1 or 2 years. But the problem is, what will happen after these 1 or 2 years? And besides, apart from the question of survival, there is also the question of economic growth, which means increasing number of Iranian youth, young people like you, like us, who graduate from the universities, they are looking for jobs, and Iran cannot provide them jobs. A lot of these people, they leave for Canada, for Australia, for anywhere they can find, okay? So Iranian state can survive. It can survive against American pressure for like 2 or 3 years, but not the Iranian people. And this is the core problem, I think, as far as these American sanctions are concerned.